The bells of Frostmark keep rang thin and cold across the mountains, the way they always did when the first snow of the season fell. King Kael Ashgrave stood at the highest window of his war tower, watching the flakes drift down over the training yards, and watching, too, the girl who swept them. She worked without looking up. A plain gray shawl, sleeves pushed to her elbows despite the cold, dark hair braided back, so tightly it looked as though it pained her. Every other servant in the keep hurried when they crossed the yard, heads bowed, eager to be out of the wind and out of sight of the wolves who ruled it. Wren never hurried. She moved like someone who had already survived worse than winter. "You are doing it again," said a voice behind him. Rowan Osler, his beta and the commander of his household guard, did not bother knocking before he spoke. 3 decades of friendship had worn that formality down to nothing. Watching the mute girl like she's a puzzle you can't solve. "She is a puzzle," Kael said. "A servant who flinches at nothing, bleeds normally when she cuts her hand on kitchen glass, and yet who I have never once heard breathe wrong in her sleep, even when the frost gets into the servants' quarters and the old ones cough through the night. Maybe she just doesn't get cold." Maybe. Kael did not believe it, and he suspected Rowan didn't either. He had found her 4 winters ago on the eastern road, half buried in snow beside an overturned grain cart, the rest of her traveling party already dead from cold. The physician had said, though something about the wounds on the horses had never sat right with Kael. She had not spoken a single word since. Not one in 4 years. The keep had decided, in the unspoken way that keeps decide things, that she was mute, that grief or shock had taken her voice, and that the king's strange mercy in keeping a human servant so close to his own chambers was simply another of his eccentricities. Kael let them believe it. It was easier than admitting that some nights, when the moon was heavy and his wolf paced restlessly under his skin, the only scent in the entire fortress that soothed the animal in him was hers, parchment, dried nitroot tea, and beneath it, so faint he'd spent years convincing himself he imagined it, something like banked embers. He was 34 years old, alpha king of the Frostmark wolves, ruler of the coldest and hardest territory north of the Ashenwood Divide, and he had begun to suspect that his wolf had chosen a woman who could not choose him back, a human girl with no voice and no name beyond the one the castle had given her. He did not know yet how wrong he was. Down in the servants' washroom, Wren, who had not always been called Wren, who had once answered to a name she had buried along with her family, bolted the door and pressed both palms flat against the cold stone wall until her hands stopped shaking. For years, she thought. For years of silence, and it is still not enough. She reached beneath a loose floorboard and drew out a small clay jar, its lid sealed with wax. Inside was a paste the color of dried blood, crushed nitroot, ash of black elm, and 3 drops of her own blood to bind it. She scraped a portion onto her tongue and swallowed, and the world went white with pain for the space of 10 heartbeats. A fire lit and doused inside her chest, over and over, the taste of copper and rot filling her mouth. When it passed, she allowed herself, finally, to breathe. She was Aurelia Emberlyn, last living daughter of the Southfire Pack, the flame-blooded royal line of the Southern Territories, a bloodline the old King Ashgrave, Kael's father, had ordered exterminated to the last child 19 years ago, when Aurelia had been small enough to hide inside a grain barrel while soldiers burned her home to the ground and called it justice. Her mother's final act had been to press a hand over her daughter's mouth and whisper one instruction: "Never let them hear you." She had obeyed that instruction for 19 years. Even after she had grown, even after her wolf had come into its full aching strength, she had swallowed poison to keep it silent, because a voice was a scent, and a scent was a trail, and a trail led men with silver knives back to whatever was left of the Emberlyn line. She had not meant to end up in Frostmark. She had meant to pass through, to gather what information she could about the son of the man who murdered her family, and to disappear again before anyone noticed a human girl with unusually keen eyes. Instead, on a night when the cold had nearly finished what the Ashgraves started, a broad-shouldered man with amber eyes had lifted her out of the snow like she weighed nothing at all, and her half-poisoned, half-starved wolf had done something unforgivable. It had recognized him. Mate, it had whispered, in the one language poison could never fully silence, and Aurelia, Ren, now always Ren, had hated it for that ever since. The betrayal came, as betrayals often do, wrapped in the shape of an ally. Lord Osric Vale had served House Ashgrave for 2 generations, his sigil, a black raven on grey, hanging in the great hall beside Kael's own banners. When word arrived that a company of the Ashen Order, the fanatical human hunters who had spent a decade turning iron and grave salt into weapons that could kill even a king of wolves, had massed near the Hollow Vale crossing, it was Osric who brought the report, Osric who urged Kael to strike first before the Order could fortify. "They will burn Widow's Hollow to the ground within the week if we do not act," Osric said, spreading a map across the war table. "A fast strike. 50 of your best. We crush the vanguard before the rest of their host arrives." Kael studied the map, then the man. He had known Osric since boyhood. He did not know, could not have known, that 3 nights prior, Osric had knelt in a candlelit chapel outside the keep's walls and sworn a different oath entirely, one that traded his king's life for a promise of land and immunity when the Ashen Order's crusade finally reached the north. 50, Kael agreed. "Rowan leads the left flank." "And the girl?" Osric asked, too casually. "I hear she's asked to travel with the convoy. Something about a convent near the Eastern Chapel." Kael's jaw tightened. Ren had, in fact, made the request 3 days earlier, in the careful written note she used in place of speech, and he had refused it twice before her silent, stubborn insistence, a look in her eyes he had never seen from her before, something almost fierce, had worn him down. "She travels under guard, in the armored wagon, nowhere near the fighting." Osric smiled, and Kael, wolf-blooded king that he was, did not smell the lie beneath it. "Not yet." They rode out 3 days later, 50 warriors of Frostmark cutting a dark line through white countryside, the armored wagon rattling at the center of the column with Ren inside it, wrapped in furs she did not need for the cold. She had not taken her night route that morning. She told herself it was practicality. She needed her senses sharp, needed to hear what her 2 human ears could not usually catch, but the truth was simpler and more frightening. Something in her had refused the poison. Something in her wanted, for the first time in 19 years, to be exactly what she was. By the time the column entered the black pine choke of Hollow Vale, she already knew something was wrong. The scent reached her long before the sound did. Oil, black powder, and beneath it, the acrid copper tang of grave salt worked into iron. "Kael." The word tore out of her, raw and unused. The first sound her voice had made in 4 years, and no one in the wagon had time to register the miracle of it before the forest exploded. The Ashen Order had not brought crossbows. They had brought iron-barreled rifles, dozens of them, positioned along the high ridges on both sides of the pass, and the volley that tore through the column caught Frostmark's warriors entirely unprepared. Men who could shrug off a blade screamed as grave salt iron shattered bone and refused to knit, their healing choked off at the wound. Rowan shifted mid-stride, his human shape tearing away to reveal a massive gray wolf, and made it 3 bounds up the ridge before a second volley caught him full in the chest. He went down hard, whimpering, silver-black blood pooling beneath gray fur. Kael fought in his half-shape, claws extended through shredded gauntlets, moving through the ambush like a blade through water, cutting down 3 riflemen before they could reload. "Hold formation," he roared, the alpha command rolling out with supernatural weight, but the formation was already breaking, because the true blow had not yet fallen. It fell when the wagon door was wrenched open, and 2 Order soldiers reached in for the human hostage they'd been promised by their inside man. "Grab the girl," one of them barked. "Osric said she's worth double if we take her alive." Ren did not scream. Something ancient and long-suppressed rose in her instead, a low sound building in her throat that had nothing human left in it. When the soldier's hand closed around her wrist, she caught his forearm in a grip that should have been impossible for a girl of her size, and snapped it like dry kindling. The second soldier raised his rifle. She didn't give him time to fire. Didn't fully shift. There was no time for that. Only let the change ride partway up through her, nails lengthening into blackened claws, teeth sharpening behind her lips. One motion opened his throat, and she was already moving before his body hit the wagon floor, dropping into a crouch on the muddy road, blood scent and gunpowder filling her lungs like the first breath after drowning. Up on the ridge, the battle had turned into slaughter. Osric's own men had turned their blades on Kael's loyalists from behind, the final proof of his treason arriving far too late to matter. Kael himself was surrounded, exhausted, parrying an iron-tipped halberd when a second hunter stepped into the blind spot behind him, leveling a heavy long rifle at his back. Ren felt the bond between them, the one she had spent 4 years denying even existed, snap taut like a rope pulled to breaking. The sound that came out of her was not human. It was not even, quite, a wolf's cry. It was older than that, a resonance that belonged to a bloodline the world had thought extinct for 19 years, and it hit the pass like a physical wave. Kael spun at the sound. What he saw made even his battle-honed instincts falter. Ren's plain servant's dress tore apart as fire-colored light erupted from her skin, not white, not silver, but the deep burning orange red of banked coals, of a hearth kept alive through a long winter. Bones reshaped themselves in the space of a heartbeat, and where a mute human servant had crouched a moment before, a wolf the size of a warhorse now stood, for the color of dying flame, eyes molten amber gold. The rifle fired. She took the shot meant for her king in the meat of her shoulder, grave salt iron searing through fur and muscle, and did not slow. She crossed the remaining distance in a single bound and buried her jaws in the shooter's throat before he could work the bolt for a second round. The pass went silent, save for the groans of the wounded. Even Osric, dropping his sword, backing away with his face gone the color of old ash, froze at the sight of a legend made suddenly, terribly real. Ren turned her burning gaze on what remained of the ambush, and finished what she'd started. There was no mercy in it, and she did not look for any. Every soldier who had raised a weapon against her king that day met the same end, until the only sound in Hollow Vale was her own ragged breathing and the crackle of a wounded man's prayers going unanswered. When it was done, she shifted back, the change costing her more this time, blood loss and shock catching up all at once, and fell to her knees in the mud, human again, bare and shaking and bleeding freely from the wound in her shoulder. Kael dropped his sword. He crossed to her on legs that did not feel entirely steady, ignoring his own injuries, and knelt in the blood-soaked road in front of her. "Ren," he said, and stopped, because that had never been her name, and some instinct told him so before his mind caught up. "You have a voice. I have a great many things I never showed you," she said, and her voice, rough with disuse, still carried an unmistakable, dangerous strength beneath the exhaustion. "My name is Aurelia. I am the last daughter of the South Firepack." Kael's amber eyes went very still. "Your father was king of the Southern Flame Wolves before yours ordered his line erased." She met his gaze without flinching, blood running down her jaw. "I came here to kill you, Kael Ashgrave. 3 years ago, when you pulled me out of the snow, I meant it to be the beginning of your ending. And now you are what I have instead of a family." Her eyes burned, molten and raw. "And I would very much like to know what that makes us." That is a large question to ask a man who was, until a moment ago, convinced you couldn't speak. "I have had 4 years to think about the answer," she said. "I am no closer to one." He reached out, brushing blood-matted hair from her face with a gentleness that seemed almost absurd given the carnage surrounding them. "Then we will have 4 more years to work it out. Together, this time." For one unguarded moment, something like hope crossed her face, the first she had allowed herself since the night her mother had pressed a hand over her mouth and told her to disappear. She almost believed, in that fragile heartbeat, that the worst of it was already behind her. He never got the chance to answer her question properly. A single shot rang out from the tree line, not from the Order's mercenaries, all of them dead or fled, but from Osric himself, drawing a last hidden pistol with the desperation of a man who had already lost everything and had nothing left to protect but his own life. The grave salt round took Kael high in the chest, inches from his heart. Aurelia felt the world narrow to a single point of fury as Kael collapsed into her arms, black veins already spreading outward from the wound, his lycanthrope healing choked into uselessness by the poison in his blood. Osric was already scrambling backward, fumbling to reload, screaming something about how none of this was meant to happen this way. She did not let him finish reloading. She crossed the distance without bothering to shift at all, driving her still-clawed hand through his chest before he could raise the weapon again, and left him where he fell without a second look. There was no room in her for anything except the man dying in the mud behind her. "No," she said, dropping back to her knees beside Kael, hands hovering uselessly over the wound. "No, stay with me." Captain Halvard, one of the few loyalists still standing, limped over cradling a broken arm and stared at her with an expression somewhere between terror and desperate hope. "My king," he rasped. "The salt is too close to the heart. There's nothing to be done." "There is," Aurelia snarled, and her eyes flashed molten gold. "Hold him still. If he thrashes, he dies faster." She did not wait for permission. She plunged her bare fingers directly into the wound, grave salt iron scorching her flesh on contact, smoke rising thin and acrid from her fingertips as she dug for the fragment lodged near his heart. Kael's whole body arched with a roar of pure agony, but she did not stop, not even when the pain in her own burned hand threatened to blind her. With a final vicious pull, she ripped the twisted metal free and flung it into the snow. The damage was already done. His chest stilled, his golden eyes dulled. "He's gone," Halvard whispered. "I am the last daughter of the South Fire Pack," Aurelia said, and her voice cracked with something that was not quite grief yet, because she refused to let it be. "My mate does not die in the mud of a road that isn't even his home territory." She leaned down, lips brushing his ear. "I forgive you for your father's sins," she whispered. "Come back to me." Her fangs extended fully, and she bit deep into the junction of his neck and shoulder, not a wound, but a claiming, pouring every ounce of her long-suppressed flame-blood venom into him, binding their souls and their healing together in the oldest and most dangerous rite her people had ever practiced. For 10 unbearable seconds, nothing happened. Then Kael's back arched off the frozen ground, a ragged gasp tearing loose from his lungs, and the black veins spreading from his wound began to recede, chased back by a warm golden-orange light that spread from the bite mark outward until it seemed to burn beneath his very skin. He was alive. The convoy that limped back into Frostmark Keep that night carried more wounded than whole, and at its center walked a girl the entire fortress had known for 4 years as a mute human servant, now unmistakably something else entirely, blood-soaked, exhausted, her scent no longer masked by any poison, radiating a dominance that made even seasoned warriors lower their eyes without understanding why. Elder Dorothea, eldest and most rigid voice on the King's Council, met them at the infirmary doors with 3 armed guards at her back. "Halt," she commanded. "You bring the daughter of our enemies into this keep. She has bewitched the king with whatever poison runs in that cursed bloodline." Aurelia did not slow her stride. She only raised her eyes to the elders, and the low growl that rolled out of her chest carried such crushing, ancestral weight that Dorothea and her guards dropped to their knees before they consciously decided to. "My mate needs a bed," Aurelia said, voice flat and cold as the mountain outside. "Move, or I will move you myself." They parted. For 3 days she did not leave his side, guarding the infirmary door against a council that would gladly have executed her the moment Kael's eyes closed. On the 4th night, his fever finally broke. He woke to firelight and the weight of her hand wrapped tight around his. When his eyes opened, hers were already waiting, burning amber meeting steady gold, the mate bond humming between them now fully, irrevocably awake. "You lied to me for 3 years," Kael said, voice a low rasp. "I was planning to kill you for most of them," Aurelia admitted, unflinching. "To avenge my family. Why didn't you?" "Because you are nothing like your father," she said. "And because the moment you pulled me out of that snow, my wolf knew you before I was willing to admit it to myself." The council did not accept the truth so gracefully. Before Kael could say more, the infirmary doors slammed open and Elder Dorothea returned, flanked now by a dozen guards bearing iron-tipped spears. "The king is awake," Dorothea announced, though nothing in her tone suggested relief. "Step away from the flame-blooded witch, your grace. The council has voted. Her bloodline is a plague on this house, and she dies at dawn." Kael sat up, sheets pooling at his waist, and the light that flared in his eyes this time was not merely anger. It was the full, crushing weight of an alpha's fury unleashed without restraint. Several guards staggered, clutching their chests as though an invisible hand had closed around their hearts. "Touch her," Kael said, "and I will end every bloodline in this room before breakfast. And doom us all regardless," Dorothea snapped back. "Look out your window, Kael, before you make threats you cannot keep. Osric's treason ran deeper than we knew. He sold the Ashen Order the Mountain Pass 3 weeks ago." Kael crossed to the window with Aurelia at his side. What he saw in the valley below stole whatever argument he'd been about to make. A sea of torchlight stretched across the snow, easily 5,000 strong, siege cannons dragged into position by draft horses and aimed squarely at Frostmark's gates. The main host of the Ashen Order had arrived while its king lay dying. "We lost 50 of our finest at the Vale," Dorothea said, quieter now, the fear beneath her fury finally showing through. "Osric took half our standing army with him when his treachery was revealed. We have perhaps 300 wolves left to hold these walls against 5,000 men and silver cannon fire. We are going to die, Kael, and it is because you sheltered a monster." Aurelia's expression did not break. If anything, something in it sharpened, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across a face the keep had only ever known as quiet and pliant. "You think I spent 4 years doing nothing but drinking poison and scrubbing your floors?" she asked the room at large. She turned to Kael, molten eyes bright with something fierce and wild. "My father was king of the South. When your father slaughtered my family, he scattered my people. He did not destroy them. They have been waiting 19 years for their princess to call them home." She pushed past the stunned council and stepped out onto the frozen balcony, letting the wind fill her lungs. Then she tipped her head back and howled. It was unlike any sound the fortress had ever heard, not merely a wolf's cry, but something resonant and ancient, a summons that shattered glass in 3 of the keep's high windows and rolled out across the valley like a living thing, cutting straight through the Ashen Order's torchlight and the crackle of their fires. For a long, agonizing minute, nothing answered. Then the earth began to tremble. It started as a distant rumble along the tree line flanking the Order's camp, low enough to be mistaken for thunder, until a massive wolf the color of a summer wildfire burst from the pines and crashed into the enemy's left flank. Then another, then 10, then 50. Within a minute, more than 800 flame-blooded wolves poured out of the forest where they had been waiting and hiding for 4 days, tracking their princess's newly unmasked scent, holding position until she finally called them home. They tore through the Ashen Order's lines before a single cannon could fire, overturning siege weapons and scattering the human host into chaos. Kael watched from the balcony, with something like awe breaking across his exhausted face. He turned to Aurelia, who was already watching him, chin lifted, daring him to be afraid of what she was. "Shall we join them, my king?" she asked. He laughed, a real laugh, the first and longer than he could remember. "We shall, my queen." They shifted together on the tower steps, a blur of gold and frost fur beside flame orange, and leapt from the wall into the fray, fighting side by side as though they had done it for 100 years instead of a single night. Surrounded by the combined might of 2 bloodlines the world had tried to keep apart, the Ashen Order's crusade broke apart before dawn, its leadership scattered or slain, its cannons buried in Frostmark snow. When the sun rose the next morning over a bloodied but victorious valley, Kael Ashgrave stood in the center of his own courtyard, the ancient crown of his house, silver and frost-blue sapphire, held in both hands. The same elders who had demanded Aurelia's execution the night before now knelt in the snow, humbled into silence by the sight of 2 armies, north and south, standing shoulder to shoulder for the first time in 19 years. He did not place the crown on his own head. He turned instead to Aurelia, no longer a fragile, voiceless servant, but a queen in every sense the word had ever meant, and set it gently upon hers. Thousands of wolves from both packs, Flame and Frost alike, lowered their heads in unified submission. The northern and southern territories, torn apart by one king's cruelty a generation ago, were bound together again by a son's mate, a king of ice and a queen of fire, ruling side by side over a kingdom finally at peace. 3 weeks later, Frostmark Keep looked almost unrecognizable. Flame wolf banners of deep orange and gold now hung beside the pale blue of the north in the great hall, and the servants who had once whispered about the strange, silent human ward now bowed their heads whenever their new queen passed, though Aurelia made a point of learning every one of their names herself, remembering what it had felt like to be invisible in a place that had never once asked who she really was. Elder Dorothea, to everyone's surprise, including her own, had not been exiled. Aurelia had insisted on it in council, over Kael's initial objection. "She was wrong about me," Aurelia said, when he asked her why. But she was not wrong to be afraid. Fear that sharp does not disappear because you execute the person who felt it. It only goes looking for someone new to hate. Better she stays where I can prove her wrong every day than go somewhere she can nurse the grudge in peace. Kael found, more and more often, that his queen's judgment ran a full step ahead of his own, sharpened, he suspected, by 19 years of having to read danger in every face she met, a skill he had never needed to learn behind the safety of a crown. On a clear evening near the solstice, they stood together on the same tower balcony where she had once been a distant, fragile shape sweeping snow from the courtyard below. Fires from the reunited Pax camp dotted the valley like fallen stars, and somewhere down among them, wolves of flame and frost were teaching each other old songs neither bloodline had sung whole in a generation. "Do you regret it?" Kael asked quietly. "Any of it? The years of silence, the poison, the lie you had to live to survive long enough to become this?" Aurelia considered the question with the same unhurried honesty she brought to everything now that she no longer had to hide it. "I regret that it was necessary," she said finally. "I do not regret who it made me. If I had come to you any other way, as a princess with an army at my back, announced with trumpets and old treaties, I don't think I would ever have known if you loved the crown I could offer you, or the woman wearing it. And now you've seen me covered in blood, howling loud enough to shatter your windows, and you still put that crown on my head instead of your own." She turned into him, resting her head against his chest, listening to the steady, familiar rhythm beneath it, a heartbeat she had once nearly stopped forever with her own hands and had chosen, in the same breath, to save. "I think that answers the question well enough." Below them, the valley that had so nearly become a grave for both their peoples glittered instead with firelight, north and south burning together at last, and for the first time in either of their long, hard lives, neither king nor queen had anything left to hide. From a silent servant girl hiding in plain sight to the fire-blooded queen who saved a kingdom, Aurelia's story is proof that the deadliest secrets are the ones dressed as nothing at all.